Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you all for being here today. I'm Jacqueline Coles. Thank you all for coming out today. I represent myself, and I also represent the Black Lowell Coalition. I would like to thank all of our friends and family for coming out and for helping to participate in this event. It came about kind of last minute, that's why it's small, but through our state representative, Ms. Vana Howard, we were able to put this together, so thank you for being here. As I mentioned, I do have a script, so sit back, relax, and listen to the storytelling. In 1780, when the Massachusetts Constitution went into effect, slavery was legal in the Commonwealth. However, during the years 1781 to 1783, in three related cases known as the Quock Walker case, the Supreme Judicial Court applied the principle of judicial review to abolish slavery. Now, we typically have a couple of lawyers in the audience. If you have any lawyers in the audience, or if we have any, please raise your hands. I think we have at least two. Okay, so if I'm saying anything wrong, you just let me know. In 1780, when the Massachusetts Constitution went into effect, slavery was legal in the Commonwealth. However, during the years 1781 to 1783, as I just said, the Quock Walker cases applied the principle of judicial review to abolish slavery. In doing so, the court held that laws and customs that sanctioned slavery were incompatible with the new state constitution. If you weren't aware, the state of Massachusetts has gone through a couple renditions of our state constitution. In the words of then Supreme Judicial Court Justice William Cushing, slavery is, in my judgment, as effectively abolished as it can be by the granting of rights and privileges in the Constitution, wholly incompatible and repugnant to its existence. This section introduces the legal status of slavery in Massachusetts prior to 1780, the Mumbet case of 1781, and the Quock Walker case. It's generally agreed that African slaves first arrived in Massachusetts in the 1630s, and slavery was legally sanctioned in 1641. During the colonial era, numerous laws were passed regulating movement, regulating marriage amongst the slaves, and Massachusetts residents actively participated in the slave trade. Historians estimate that between 1755 and 1764, the Massachusetts slave population was approximately 2.2% of the total population. The slave population was generally concentrated in the industrial and coastal towns. As the rhetoric supporting independence of the colonies from Great Britain intensified in the colony of Massachusetts, some noted the glaring inconsistency of arguing for the rights of Englishmen while owning slaves. For example, James Otis, a leading proponent of colonial independence, wrote in a highly regarded and influential 1964 pamphlet that the colonists are, by the law of nature, freeborn, as indeed all men are, white or black. I always pause because if you've noticed, in our federal constitution and in our state constitution, we still refer to men. Men means women. At some point in the future, we will change that, and it will say all humans or all men and women or whatever we identify as. Historian Joanne Pope Mellish observed that the onset of the revolution both intensified the attack and weakened the structures and practices that supported the institution of slavery. New England was not ultimately dependent on slave labor, and the war disrupted patterns of production and trade in the very areas in which slave labor was most heavily engaged. Slaves, too, were active in seeking the end of slavery in Massachusetts. For example, in 1773, a group of slaves petitioned the General Court to end slavery. The General Court at that time was the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and directly tied their search for liberty to the colonists' struggles with Great Britain. Because Massachusetts slaves were considered both as property and as persons before the law, slaves could institute and prosecute lawsuits in the courts against their master, the defendant, who would be obliged to demonstrate their lawful title to ownership by their slave. By 1780, nearly 30 slaves had sued their master for their freedom, most during the years following 1764. However, these cases were not decided on the basis of any natural right to freedom. Instead, the courts required a specific point of law to decide in favor of a slave. such as a master's broken promise to grant freedom or the questionable slave status of the individual's mother. So as you can see here, we have Elizabeth Freedom and we have Quock Walker. There are some debates as to whether Mom Bet was a predecessor to, a catalyst for the activities that occurred with Quock Walker. I like to believe that she was. And the reason why she doesn't give as much notoriety is because she is a woman. That may not be true. I can see some people cringing. I just like to say that. May not be true. Let's talk a little bit about Mom Bet. The 1781 Berkshire County of Brom and Bet versus Ashley, often referred to the Mom Bet or Elizabeth Freeman case, was unique because it occurred less than 1 year after the adoption of the Massachusetts Constitution, and because in contrast to prior freedom suits, there was no claim that John Ashley, the slave owner, had violated a specific law. This case was a direct challenge to the very existence of slavery in Massachusetts. During the 1770s, Mom Bet was a slave in the household of Colonel John Ashley of Sheffield, a prominent citizen who at the time also served as a judge of the Berkshire Court of Common Pleas. In early January 1773, Ashley became moderator of a committee of 11 local citizens, including attorney Theodore Sedgwick, that wrote a document known as the Sheffield Declaration. This document, approved by the committee on January 12, 1773, expressed anger at how Great Britain was treating her subjects in the colony of Massachusetts. The Sheffield Declaration requested its local representative to the General Court in Boston to consider the declaration and to use every constitutional means in his power that the grievances complained of may be redressed. According to later stories often told about Mom Bet, her freedom suit was prompted by her overhearing dinner table conversations in the Ashley home about the promise of liberty made in the Sheffield Declaration. When the case was tried in August 1781 before the County Court of Common Pleas in Great Barrington, Sedgwick argued that the Massachusetts Constitution had outlawed slavery. The jury determined that Brom and Bet were not Ashley's property. The court set Bet and Brom free and awarded them 30 shillings. I did a little Googling, and I think around 30 shillings is maybe $450 today. I'm not exactly sure, but I believe that's the case. Ashley appealed to the Supreme Judicial Court, but abandoned his appeal several months later. The timing of his decision suggests that Ashley may have determined that an appeal was futile, following the first ruling of the Supreme Judicial Court in the Quock Walker case. As I'm telling you about Quock Walker, Miss Martha Mayo will follow soon and tell you about the relation of Quock Walker and his family here in Lowell. So we've already mentioned Quock Walker was a series of 3 cases. Quock Walker was a slave, purchased as an infant by James Caldwell in 1754. In 1763, Caldwell died, and his widow married another man. Walker became the property of Jennison, who resided in central Massachusetts town of Barre. In 1781, at the age of 28, Walker fled to the home of the Caldwell's son. Jennison recaptured, beat, and re-enslaved Quock Walker. 3 court proceedings followed. In the first case, Walker, with the assistance of leading Worcester County attorney Levi Lincoln and Caleb Strong, sued Jennison for assault and battery. For those that don't know, you can have a civil case for assault and battery, and you can have a criminal case for assault and battery. So that might be to your benefit. Take that as a nugget home. Walker claimed he had been injured without right, as James Caldwell, his first master, had promised Walker freedom by the age of 25, and he's now 28. This case was tried before a jury in the Worcester County Court of Common Pleas. The jury found that the said Quirk is a free man and not the proper Negro slave of Jennison, and awarded Walker damages of 50 pounds. In the second case, tried during the same court session, which was typical then, Jennison sued Caldwell's brothers for interfering with his property. Jennison claimed the brothers had unlawfully enticed Walker away from for their own benefit. In this action, Jennison prevailed, and the jury awarded him damages of 25 pounds. Each side appealed these contradictory verdicts, and the two cases were placed on the docket of the Supreme Judicial Court in 1781. Jennison was ruled in default on his appeal for failing to present the required papers. The Caldwell brothers also prevailed in their appeal to the state's high court. Reporters of the trial reflect that attorney Levi Lincoln, who represented the Caldwell brothers, centered his argument on the promises of freedom contained in the new Massachusetts Constitution. Meanwhile, in what became the third Quock Walker case, the Attorney General prosecuted Jennison for criminal assault and battery upon Quock Walker. Jennison was indicted in September 1781. Though this case did not come before the Supreme Judicial Court until April 1783. In his charge to the jury, Supreme Judicial Court Chief Justice William Cushing announced that slavery was incompatible with the new Massachusetts Constitution. These sentiments that are favorable to the natural rights of mankind led the framers of our Constitution of Government, by which the people of this Commonwealth have solemnly bound themselves to each other, to declare that all men are born free and equal, and that every subject is entitled to liberty, and to have it guarded by the laws as well as his life and property. In short, without resorting to implication in constructing the Constitution, slavery is, in my judgment, as effectively abolished as it can be by the granting of rights and privileges. The jury convicted Jennison, and the court ordered him to pay a fine of 40 shillings, about $600 today. The 1790 census recorded no slaves in Massachusetts, but historians tend to disagree over the role of the Quock Walker case in abolishing slavery in Massachusetts. The case was not widely reported at the time, and changing economic conditions and public opinion, increasingly hostile to slavery, doubtlessly played an important role in slavery's demise. However, the Quock Walker case, it was clear that slave owners would not prevail in the state courts, and this is how slavery effectively was ended in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I have a quote here by one of my professors, actually, the Honorable Peter W. Agnes, Jr., retired Massachusetts Appeals Court. The Quock Walker cases stand not only as a monument in the history of freedom because they signaled the end of slavery in Massachusetts, but also as a milestone in constitutional history. The gentleman who was the judge in the Quock Walker case later went on to be one of the first Supreme Court justices in the United States of America. I would like to now pass this microphone on to the esteemed, to the noted, the most beautiful Miss Martha Mayo of UMass Lowell, Center for Lowell History, and she will tell us about Quock Walker's familial ties in Lowell.
All right, so now we'll get into why I got involved in this Quock Walker story. I was the head of the Center for Lowell History, or at that time it was called Special Collections, at UMass Lowell on the North Campus in the library. And this young woman came in. She was a grad student from the from Columbia University, and she was spending her summer in Lowell with her aunt, and she was going to do a seminar paper on Lowell's community of color. And I was brand new, well, fairly new, and didn't realize that there was even a community of color in the 1820s. So we began going through every records that we could find, newspapers and marriage records and death records and city directories. And we found this cluster of men and women of color who lived in Lowell that seemed to all be connected. And so we were trying to find out. So she wrote a seminar paper. It was great, really smart. And I kept on working on these families, and I said, well, they're all Lewis's, and they're in Lowell. They're running barber shops and hairdresser shops as early as mid-1820s. And the reason they came is, well, the first one I'm going to talk about is John Levy. And so I know John Levy comes really early. There's an ad in an 1826 newspaper announcing that he's opened a hairdressing shop and has beautiful fashionable curls that he sells in this shop. And the reason they need more barbers and hairdressers is that Lowell was just started. I mean, some early investors came, bought a bunch of land on the Pawtucket Falls and the Merrimack River to start to build small textile mills, which eventually would become very large. But in 1823, when they first came here, they were pretty small and there weren't very many, but they needed workers, and there were not enough workers in the greater Chelmsford area. So they began recruiting, particularly women and some men, to fill the jobs of weavers and spinners and carders. And so the local community leaders realized they needed more small businesses like barbershops and hairdressers to serve this community. So apparently Kimball, who lived actually in Belvedere Village, which is part of Tewksbury, which is now East Merrimack Street, there was an inn, he went down to Cambridge and tried to recruit some barbers and hairdressers to come to Lowell. And so the first one, well, they kind of all came together. So eventually four brothers and a brother-in-law came to Lowell to work in the mid-1820s, early 1830s. And this John Levy is one of them. Now, he's married to Sophia Lewis, who I researched John, and then I researched Sophia Lewis, and I find that she's the daughter of this woman, Minor Walker Lewis, and her father was Peter Lewis. And she was born, and they were born in Barre, Massachusetts. So I keep on researching Minor Walker and don't realize, but the records show that she is the sister of Quock Walker. And that's how I find out that Quock Walker is even historical or a case or ended slavery in Massachusetts. And my understanding is the third case, the third trial, they include all of his siblings, and he has at least a dozen siblings, maybe more. His father kept marrying women, and they kept having babies, and the woman kept dying and married another woman, and they kept having babies. So there are a lot of siblings by 1783, but they're all included in this last case. So Minor Walker is living in Barre, and she marries Peter Lewis, who's from Vermont, black farmer, and about 1820, they and their 10 children moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts. So here they're living in Cambridge, and Sophia Lewis is in Cambridge, and she meets a young man who is serving as a waiter for Harvard College, and his name is John Levy. And John Levy's story is, a lot of what we know about him is because of a series of newspaper articles, as well as in his later years, shortly before he died, he published an autobiography. And so that helps us obviously tell much of his story. And his story is really unique and interesting. He was born on the island of Nevis, and his parents were African Jews who had escaped Spain and come to the Caribbean to live. They were plantation owners, they had slaves, and when he was about 14, his father sent him off with a friend who was a sea captain to apprentice as a sailor, and he sailed this young man, older boy, young man, sailed all over the Atlantic to London and the Caribbean, and eventually ended up in Boston and decided that was enough sailing. And so he settled in Cambridge, and so John Levy and Sophia Lewis got married, and he came to Lowell. And he was really, as early as, in the same time period, they had started the Anti-Slavery Society in Massachusetts, and he became a member. And he was obviously very articulate and well-read and a great writer. So he wrote a lot of articles in The Liberator, which was a newspaper that was edited by William Lloyd Garrison, and it was an anti-slavery newspaper. And one of the other activities that he got involved in here in Lowell was helping the Lowell Female Anti-Slavery Society start. And that organization was very active in Lowell. Many of the women who were weavers and spinners became members of that anti-slavery society. He was also in very he initially had a shop on Washington Street, which is now East Merrimack Street, and then moved his shop to Washington Inn, which was on Central Street, and he bought a home or built a home on Charles Street, which is a street that runs behind Church Street, behind the plaza. That's Charles Street, and he built that house with the aid of Royal Southwick, who some of us know as the namesake for Southwick Hall at the university. He was a abolitionist, he was a Quaker, and he was agent of the Lowell Carpet Company. So he was he helped Louis Levy establish his house, build his house, and establish his business. And that business was sort of that end of what we call Lowell, but the Central Street, back Central Street area. His brother-in-laws, there was Peter and Walker Lewis. His two brother-in-laws were also initially on Washington Street, and then they moved their shops several times, and eventually ends up on Dutton Street, where the CTI Youth Building is. But back to Levy. So he's in Lowell. He's pretty well established. His first wife, unfortunately, passes away, and he marries a second time. And he's very involved in this anti-slavery organization. So he travels all over New England and New York, helping to set up mini conferences and lectures. So he brings people like, even to Lowell, he brings people like Frederick Douglass, Lloyd Garrison, George Thompson, a lot of anti-slavery speakers and lecturers to this city, as well as setting up these mini conferences all over New England. In the late 1840s, he moves to Lawrence, this new industrial town, sets up a barbershop, and spends his rest of his work life in Lawrence. But he does continue to bring in speakers up until and through the Civil War. So that's his story. That's one of them. That was father of the brothers. I'm not going to go to all the brothers, but I'll spend some time on two other brothers. One that I mentioned was Walker Lewis, and he actually his full name is Quock Walker Lewis, and he was named after his uncle, Quock Walker. And he comes a little later. He's in Boston, living in Cambridge and working in Boston, and he's very involved in a number of organizations that support civil rights and equality and black rights. One of them is the Massachusetts. I get this wrong every time. Massachusetts General Colored Association. And what they did to improve the conditions of the black community in Massachusetts was they wrote pamphlets, and they signed petitions, and they published what's called David Walker's Appeal, which was a very well-known black book that tries to raise the level of understanding of the black community and to try to gain stronger rights for the black community in Massachusetts and in the country. So Walker Lewis, as I said, had a shop on Dutton Street and with his brother, and they buy a house, two-family house in Centerville on First Street. And now First Street doesn't exist any longer. It's where the VFW highway was put in, probably in the 1950s, 60s. So he had a two-family, and they were actually his families, the Walker Lewis and Peter Lewis, their families, were members of this church. And so there's some really interesting, not a lot, but there's some little interesting details in Reverend Edson's diaries that talk about serving this small community of color that are over in the Dracut area, that live in the Dracut area at the time. In the 1850s, that part of Dracut is annexed and becomes what we know as Centerville. Other organizations that Walker Lewis was involved in Boston. They were sort of Massachusetts-wide, but they were headquartered in Boston, was the Prince Hall Freemasons. It was the first Masonic group that was established for blacks in Massachusetts, and they actually had to get their charter from the London Freemasons organization in order to get the lodge chartered here in Massachusetts. Another organization that he was involved in that was statewide was it's called the African Humane Society, which sounds like maybe it helped animals, but it didn't. It raised money and provided funds for funerals for people of color, poor people of color. And then he kind of, I don't know if he went off the rails, but it became very interesting, and a lot of research has been done on his activities and involvement with the Mormon Church. He was one of the first black elders in the church, and he was inducted as an elder leader within the Mormon Church in the 1840s. And then in the early 1850s, the Mormon Church, which is based in Salt Lake City, the word came on down from on high that blacks could no longer be members of the church. So he actually traveled from Lowell to Salt Lake Valley, as he called it at the time, in the 1850s, to protest this decision. He failed. He came back, and I don't know if it was because of that, but he only lived a few more years before he passed away. The third person I want to talk about is Peter Lewis. And Peter Lewis, a brother of Walker Lewis and brother-in-law John Levy, came to Lowell about the same time as about 1830, 35 in that time range. And he was active in the Underground Railroad and also active in the anti-slavery movement. But one of the stories that I want to tell about him is that he had 4 children, and they attended Lowell schools. The Lowell schools from elementary all the way through high school at that time had always been integrated and was integrated. So they attended a primary school on Kirk Street, kind of opposite, roughly where we're standing on the other side of the street. There was a small primary school that his children would come across the bridge and attend that school. And there was a traveling exhibition that came to Lowell. It was kind of like a photograph exhibit, but it was long before photography. It was before photography was really established. So they would have these screens, and they would show images on them, almost like a diorama. So a cross between a diorama and a photograph. And they would travel this. Winter would travel this exhibition all over the North and the South. And there's an ad in one of the papers in Lowell in 1844 saying that this Winter posted, indicating that children would get a discounted rate and it would be 10 cents, particularly if they came as a school group. So a group of children from this elementary school with Peter Lewis as the chaperone went to the exhibition at Old City Hall, and the other children were allowed in, and his children were not allowed in. And the city went literally ballistic. Every newspaper is printing articles about how outrageous this is and how terrible this is and how this is not how we treat our citizens. And remarkably, the newspapers have long editorials regarding this situation. And remarkably, I think, Winter, who is the manager of this exhibition, posts a long letter defending his position of excluding these children from entering into the exhibition hall, because if people in the South hear about the fact that he let these black children into the show, then they won't go to his show. They'll boycott his show. And so that was his reasoning, and he felt fully justified. Well, he was pretty much run out of Lowell on a rail, and the papers kept on writing articles and encouraging the citizens of Lowell, the citizens of other states and other cities and other states not to attend this exhibition. So it left a mark. Now his children ended up growing up in Lowell, and two of the boys, end up serving in the Civil War, and one of them joins the Navy really early, like 1861. I mean, like days after the firing of Fort Sumter. The Army is slow at allowing blacks into the service in the 53rd and 54th, 55th. Those regiments weren't started until 1863, and that's when the second son joins one of those regiments. So these two young men live here for a long time. We found in the City Hall Veterans records, we found indications that they were getting some subsidies through the Veterans Acts, through the Veterans laws and acts in Massachusetts and federal laws. So it was interesting to see these men lived a long life. They ended up having, we call it daughtered out. They had daughters, but the daughters never married, so that was the end of that line. So unfortunately, the only one that had any long family left, that went into the future was Quock Walker. Was John Levy, who had a daughter, Elizabeth, who ends up, after her father dies, she ends up going to Michigan. There was a small black community that had been started in the upper Michigan area that was created by Southern former slaves. And so she lives there, marries 2 or 3 times, has a ton of kids. So her longevity and her legacy is long remained. So those are three of the men. There's a lot of other research that has been done on the people of color in Lowell, and we have it on our website at the center. It's called, if you Google Center for Lowell History, Untold Black Stories, it should pop up, and there's probably 20 or 30 stories that we have about other people of color and other white men and women who have helped in the Underground Railroad movement and the anti-slavery movement in Massachusetts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Martha. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our state representative, Ms. Vanna Howard, with the reading of the proclamation.
The Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a proclamation. Whereas this year marks the 241st anniversary of the third of the Quock Walker cases that constitutionally ended slavery in Massachusetts, and whereas Quock Walker entered the historical record in 1754 when parents Mingo and Dinah and their 9-month-old son Quock was sold to James Caldwell of the Rutland District for 180 pounds. And whereas in 1780, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts adopted a constitution in which Article 1 read, "All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights," and
whereas in 1871, Quock Walker, having been promised his freedom at age 25 by his previous enslaver, self-emancipated to work on a nearby farm in Barre, Massachusetts, and was violently pursued by his then enslaver, Nathaniel Jennison. And whereas on June 12, 1781, a jury of the Worcester County Court of Common Pleas determined that Quock Walker was a free man and charged Nathaniel Jameson 50 pounds for assault and battery.
Whereas in 1783, Justice William Cushing, Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, noted in his instructions to the jury, the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our own conduct and Constitution. And whereas the Quock Walker case resulted in the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts over 70 years before President Abraham Lincoln Emancipation Proclamation.
Whereas Quock Walker and his siblings acquired property in Barre, Massachusetts, and enjoyed other liberties, and whereas Quock Walker's peers and their children became entrepreneurs and active abolitionists who established the Massachusetts General College Association, the first all-black abolitionist organization in the United States, to promote the welfare of the race by working for the destruction of slavery.
Now, therefore, I, Mara T. Healy, Governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, do hereby proclaim July 8th, 2023, to be Massachusetts Emancipation Day, aka Quock Walker Day.
And urge all the residents of the Commonwealth to take cognizance of this event and participate fittingly in its observance. Given at the Executive Chamber in Boston this first day of July in the year 2023, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 246th, by Her Excellency Mara T. Healy, Governor of the Commonwealth, Kimberly Driscoll, Lieutenant Governor of the Commonwealth, William Francis Galvin, Secretary of the Commonwealth. God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Thank you very much. Our state representative, Ms. Vanna Howard. And I would like to say again a special thank you to Ms. Martha Mayo, former director, UMass Lowell Center for Lowell History. I would also like to thank the Lowell Board of Parks, because without them, we would not legally be able to be here. So, thank them. Living Water Center of Hope for their restroom. I thank you all for coming out today. I appreciate your time, and this now concludes our event. See you next year.